Welcome everyone to another instalment of the ICMJ webinar series. This is number 4. As Amy mentioned, as we go through today, feel free to throw any questions in the chat group, those both towards the speakers and also out towards the group. So now we'll just jump into it. This week we're going to have a really in-depth look at carbon neutrality within the Australian beef industry. Obviously, over the past decade, the red meat industry, particularly beef production, has been in the spotlight and certainly in the headlines in terms of carbon emissions and its effect on the environment and global warming. So today we've got a couple of speakers with us that have made some really good inroads into tackling the issues associated with carbon outputs from meat production. So the first we've got today is James Madden. He's the Managing Director of Flinders & Co, which is Australia's first company to fully commit to carbon neutrality. And James is going to run us through some information about Flinders & Co, also about the decision-making processes he's gone through to take their company in that direction from a social and production point of view. The second we've got is Doug McNicholl. Doug's the Program Manager for Sustainability and CN30 at Meat and Livestock Australia. So he's going to run us through the CN30 project, its complications and also its impacts across the red meat supply chain. So James, do you want to jump in and kick us off there?
Yeah, thanks Hamish. Thanks for the intro. I do keep claiming that we're the first company to go carbon neutral, or the first meat company, and no one's pulled me up on it yet. So I keep spouting that propaganda, and sort of helps. It's a nice marketing angle for us. But yeah, today I've got 20 minutes, so I'll go until about 12:25, and I just want to cover off a few things. And I think today's discussion will have a bit of technical focus on it, and maybe Doug will get into some of those technicalities. But for what I want to talk about, I think I want to keep it quite broad and strategic and give everyone a bit of an insight into what goes on in my company, what the brief history of our company was, how we arrived at a point where we decided that we wanted to go carbon neutral, why, and what the results have been. You know, has it worked? Has it not worked? Is it somewhere in between? And just finally, I might, if I've got time, I might touch on a few other issues around social license, because I think that's one of the big pieces that the carbon neutral project plays into, is this idea of social license as an industry and us being able to justify what we do to people and to show people that it's not necessarily bad as an industry. Meat is not necessarily bad, despite what a lot of headlines and plant-based companies might be encouraging people to think, that there is some really good things happening in the industry as well. So I'll start just by sharing my other screen with everyone. This is a PowerPoint presentation I did for another conference, so there'll be bits that I might skip through. Can everyone see that? Is that showing the right screen? Does that look right to you, Hamish?
Just got to switch, mate.
Yeah,
I'll switch again.
Yep.
Yeah. All right. How's that?
Perfect.
That's better. Okay. So a brief history of my company and why I'm sitting here in front of you today. That's my father, David. So Dad's a farmer. He got involved in the meat industry after farming, and one day he'd sort of finished a project and decided that he wanted to start his own business. So he decided, I don't know why, I've asked him many times, but for some reason he decided to buy this small, busted, tiny abattoir on Flinders Island, which is in Bass Strait. And, you know, as if running an abattoir is not hard enough, when you make it extremely small and extremely remote, it becomes, workable to nightmare. And we had a lot of nightmares at that abattoir on Flinders Island. But what it forced us to do, when we were running this small abattoir on the island, we learned a lot about telling the story of the product, because we had to. we needed to derive a premium from the products that we produced on Flinders to offset our higher costs. And one of the things that happened was we actually weren't able to find a distributor for our products in Melbourne. So we ended up deciding that we'd do it ourselves. And I was based in Melbourne, and we started approaching chefs and restaurants and retailers direct, which is the sort of luxury we had being a small processor. And we ended up building our own distribution business in Melbourne. Long story short, we ended up adding in other products alongside our own Flinders Island products. We ended up becoming the distributor for a lot of the Greenham brands, which you might know, such as Cape Grim, Robbins Island Wagyu, etc. And so over the years, we became a full line meat distributor, I guess you could say, focusing on premium customers. What I mean by full line is we do lamb, we do pork, we do chicken, beef, small goods, we do lots of duck, game, whatever it is, we do it. And so our business sort of had these two sides. We had our distribution business in Melbourne and our processing business on Flinders Island. And in 2017 or 18, I think, we ended up selling the abattoir on Flinders Island and focusing just on our business in Melbourne. And so what happened when we did that was we were still known as Flinders Island Meat as a boutique meat processor, but we'd become a distributor in Melbourne with no abattoir holdings, nothing. We didn't own anything on Flinders Island anymore. So there was this misalignment between our company brand and what our company was actually doing. And so that caused me to see this misalignment and think, we need to really take this opportunity to perhaps rebrand our company and really think strategically about where we're going as a company and where we want to go for the next 5, 10, 20 years, and where I want to go as a young guy in the meat industry. What do I actually want to achieve over the next 10 or 20 years? So the first try with this rebranding was a real old world look, and I look at it now, and thankfully we didn't go with it, but it was kind of like, if anyone's from Melbourne, the sort of Fitzroy hipster, old worldy type vintage clothing shop look was what we were going for some reason. We ended up binning that because I started asking myself some more in-depth questions around what, sorry guys, I've just realized my computer's unplugged. I'm just going to plug it back in one sec. Okay, and I'm back. I started to ask some questions around what do I want to look back on my career and say that I was able to achieve? And that really, started pulling out some interesting questions around, do we want to stay in the meat industry? Is the meat industry sustainable? Is it defensible? We've got an opportunity here to perhaps go left or go right with the rebranding of our business. And do we genuinely want to stay in this industry? And that caused me to look at a sort of rapidly evolving trend within companies, which is around purpose. And the best illustration that I could find for purpose was illustrated by a guy called Simon Sinek. So you might have seen this before, but it's called the Golden Circle. And the Golden Circle is a way of explaining, I guess, alignment within an organization. So if you read the headings here, you have the outer circle. It's kind of like an onion. You get deeper as you go through the layers. You start with what you do as a company. You might sell meat, you might be a hairdresser, you might be an accountant, but that's the actual activity of what you do. How you do it is usually your unique point of difference. So what sets you aside as a different proposition to other companies. And then the why is quite an important one in this model. It's why do you do what you do? What gets you out of bed in the morning as someone running a company, or what
He might have lost battery there, Hamish.
Yeah, I think we've lost him there. That's all right. We might wait for him to come back online. I'm sure he'll jump back in soon. While we're waiting though, Doug, do you want to jump into your side of the presentation, or wait? We could wait a couple of minutes.
It's a tricky one. This one's a first for
Yes.
the multiple Zoom things I think everyone's been doing. If James had sent me his deck, I'm sure I could do my best to represent it on his behalf, but he didn't. So
that's all right. He's just flicked me a text, and he's just going to jump and fix his computer. But he's said to jump onto your side in the meantime, there, Doug.
Yeah, right. Yeah,
we can finish off James at the end there, following up with your details.
No problem. Let me share my screen and no doubt go through the same. Change 2 seconds. How's that? Is that coming through okay?
Yep, we've got you there.
Good stuff.
Perfect.
Okay, guys. Well, let's reset. We'll hear from James again in a moment, but I'm just going to take probably 25 minutes of your time. I'm going to spend a little bit of time getting into a few bits and pieces around the path to carbon neutral red meat industry in Australia. It's obviously a little bit of a recap on overview of MLA, just the one slide. I want to touch on the transition from the industry strategy, so the Red Meat Advisory Council's 2030 strategy, into MLA action within the compounds of MLA as a business. And then I'm going to get into the why, the what, and the how. So that's kind of where James was explaining the why of his business. Well, I'll be tackling that same cascading logic, but within the context of the red meat industry's carbon neutral 2030 initiative. So just a quick overview of MLA. As most of you would know, but some perhaps benefit from a refresher, we invest in research, development, adoption, and marketing initiatives that contribute to producer profitability, sustainability, and global competitiveness. You can see there at the top right-hand side, we sit within a bit of an ecosystem of policy and strategy organisations, and at the very top, the Red Meat Advisory Council is the industry's peak advisory council, and they set the policy and strategic direction for the industry, and hopefully all of you are aware of the Red Meat 2030 strategy. Underneath that are a number of service providers, and I think some of them are on the call with us today. So Australian Meat Processor Corporation, who service the needs of the red meat processing sector, Live Corp, who service the needs of the live export industry, and Meat and Livestock Australia, and we service the needs of the grain-fed, grass-fed, goat meat and sheep meat industries. And I guess in doing that, we touch a number of stakeholders right along the red meat value chain. So from paddock to plate, customer and consumer groups, the communities that surround our industries, government, as well as R&D and commercialisation partners. This is just a little bit of a page grab of RMAC's Red Meat 2030 strategy, and the significance of that today is that one of the call-outs, or a couple of the key call-outs that are of relevance to today, one is the aspiration to double the value of red meat sales by 2030, and at the same time, reach a carbon neutral position. So we now need to consider then how we transition from industry policy and strategy into MLA action or service provider action. And the same transition occurs for MLA as it does for AMPC and LiveCorp. So we have the Red Meat 2030 strategy. Since its release, MLA has developed its own strategic plan to deliver the first 5 years of Red Meat 2030 by investing levies, government monies and voluntary contributions. And we do that on a rolling annual basis. So we put in place annual investment plans across our various programs of work to execute against strategic objectives. There are 6 key areas of focus in MLA strategic plan. It's similar to the Red Meat 2030 areas of focus: our people, our customers and consumers and communities, our livestock, our environment, which is where a lot of the Carbon Neutral 2030 initiative sits, our key markets, and the systems that underpin our production. For the first time in MLA's recent history, we've seen a convergence of what we call market pull and technology push factors, which I'll touch on in a moment, that have led us to believe that there are significant opportunities for industry to capture value and increase profitability alongside red meat production by commercialising the service we provide, the environmental services we provide to the community. And so we'll be spending a period of time now identifying opportunities and business models to explore in this area. And we're also investing in partnerships across the supply chain and across sectors to identify high value opportunities for the conversion of a whole range of things. So carbon into useful products and also waste into useful products. And so you might be asking, so what's the rationale behind this? You know, what's driving this movement? And as I mentioned, I'm going to talk about some market pull factors amongst consumers and community sentiment, as well as the investment community. And then also talk about the technology push factors that, you know, there are current and emerging solutions to some of the really tough problems we face globally in addressing climate change. And the good news for our industry is that these technologies can provide multiple benefits, whether they're diverting energy lost in methane from enteric methane emissions into productive pathways, or whether it's capturing methane emissions from red meat processing waste and diverting it into energy within the plant, or whether it's better utilisation of carbon capture and storage in our grazing systems in plants that can provide multiple benefits, be it shade, shelter, a source of nutrition as well. So some market pull factors. I just want to touch on some of the market research that MLA does in our market side of the business. Beef was on the menu over 90% of Australian households last year, and lamb in over 76% of households. And so it's obvious that we want to maintain menu listings in this area. At the same time, MLA research shows that red meat producers are trusted by consumers, with 93% saying producers are responsible custodians of the land, and we want to maintain that trust. For the past 3 years, the number of metropolitan people who identify as vegan or vegetarian has remained stable at 7%, and those and of those, 14% occasionally eat meat. So industry obviously wants to limit the number of consumers choosing not to red meat, and I'll talk on the next slide about the reasons why consumers choose not to eat red meat outside of price and nutrition. But environment is up there as a reason why consumers choose not to eat red meat, alongside animal welfare credentials. And again, at the same time, 15% of meat eaters have been vegetarian in the past. So there's a high rate, return rate to eating red meat. And we want to make sure we continue to grow that return rate. So as I mentioned, at the national level, cost and health remain the primary drivers of red meat reduction. And so as the industry, we've got to remain laser focused on cost and health attributes of the products we supply consumers. But the data that's been shown here is in response to a research question that was posted in our domestic consumer survey saying, what is the main reason for eating less red meat? And these trend lines show changes over time, so response rates across time in the different surveys. And as I mentioned, green and this pink colour reflect price and health. The bottom, there are a bunch of other lines, and one of them is this green line, which is indicating response to environmental stewardship credentials. So right now, it's been a consistently low trend for reasons why people choose not to eat red meat due to environmental reasons. And a lot of what we do is built on maintaining that trend at a low point. However, there's also data emerging that verifiable sustainability claims are an enabler to sales growth. And if we think back to the Red Meat 2030 strategy, or the aspiration of doubling the value of sales, we then need to unpack how we can communicate new and emerging value propositions to consumers. And attaching sustainability claims to what are high quality, high eating quality, high satisfactory eating experience red meat products, sustainability credentials, is another way of attaching a value proposition to current and future consumers. So you can see here, this is Nielsen data 2016, showing that packaging sustainability claims around packaging materials, sustainable fishing, this is multiple sectors, animal welfare, production methods, business practices, so how businesses and industries are practicing, and sustainable farming, or the use of sustainable farming practices and communicating that to consumers, are enablers. They're not the primary driver, but there are important enablers to sales growth. You would all be aware that we now know that the red meat industry contributes to Australia's greenhouse gas accounts. In 2005, the light blue line shows whole of economy emissions, and the darker blue line shows the Australian red meat industry's contribution. So it was about 20% in 2005. That trend is dramatically, that number has dramatically decreased since then. We are now 10% of national emissions. So the spotlight is on the major industries that are contributing to the national inventory. And let's be clear, primary fossil fuel use, transport, industrial process, and domestic energy and domestic and commercial sectors are the primary contributors. However, we're ranking in that fourth kind of area of contributing to national accounts. So we do have a role to play. So in response to that, we're seeing not only the red meat industry, but our competitors launching low and zero carbon aspirations. So Brazil has launched a carbon neutral Brazilian beef standard, and they're one of our key competitors in international export markets. New Zealand has now ratified a zero carbon bill. We've seen things like the IPCC releasing a report that are influencing consumer and diet choices in the food industry. So trying to communicate with consumers about responsible diet choices to reduce their carbon footprint. We've also seen investors now looking at companies and assessing their performance in reducing emissions, and that forms part of their investment decision about whether to invest alongside the more established economic criteria. So there's some kind of market pull factors. I want to talk a little bit now about the technology push factors. And the good news for our industry is these are genuinely providing not only emissions reduction or carbon storage solutions, but they're delivering economic opportunities to our industry, which is to some extent largely unique to our industry. So for example, novel animal supplements and legumes can increase live weight gain or live weight performance of animals and dramatically reduce enteric methane emissions. Legumes also fix nitrogen into soils and improve soil health. Increased soil organic matter, that is promoting plant growth into soils, the depth in soils, from deep-rooted plants, pastures, legumes, and trees, involves improves soil health, can improve feed-based productivity and drought resilience, because those plants become more resilient with deep roots in moisture-stressed environments. Improvements in genetics and herd management can also reduce methane emissions per kilogram of live weight produced, and enable productivity improvements alongside reductions in emissions intensity. And planned integration of trees and shrubs into grazing systems can improve carbon storage, provide shade and shelter for livestock, and offer biodiversity benefits. But these needs to be planned integrations and thought through. Therefore, some rewards for climate smart red meat businesses include maintaining that consumer and community support for the industry, maintaining market access, in particular to high value markets where we're looking to increase or double the value of red meat sales into 2030, access to capital, so continuing access to capital and even getting incentives or lower cost of capital for businesses that can show progress in this area. Limit the need for regulation, so for government or for anyone else to intervene in our industry and interfere with how businesses operate. And promoting climate resilience, so improving our ability to adapt to changing weather and climate conditions. So now I'm going to talk to you about, well, what is the Carbon Neutral 2030 initiative? And look, there are two key things or two key parts to it. One is the aspirational target itself, that the red meat industry will achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. And there's an equation there that at the bottom that shows the simple function of emissions minus what we capture in the land in which we operate needs to equal a net position of 0 tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent emissions by the year 2030. So there's the definition and the target itself. And then obviously there's a delivery component, and that was going to require a coordinated research, development and adoption effort. This is just providing you an overview of the system. I'm not going to get into it in detail, and I'm happy to provide a whole bunch of information to those who are interested offline later. But what this is showing is work in this area needs to consider a systems approach. So understanding, so the mauve-coloured bubbles there are sources of nitrous oxide emissions from our industry, originating from how we utilise manure or treat manure from livestock, also fertiliser use or nitrogen-derived fertiliser use in our sector. A big important one for us is methane emissions, which is the peach-coloured bubbles being shown to be flying in the atmosphere, which is a byproduct of digestion. We also then got to factor in fossil fuel use and the carbon dioxide emissions that result from using fossil fuels in processing, in feedlots and on farm. And then where the arrows are pointing down, that's indicating the capture of carbon dioxide in plants and storing it in our grazing systems. And the technologies we use to do that are the ones that have been with us as long as we've existed as a species. So they're plants, and choosing the right plants that enable productivity in our grazing systems. So I just want to recap again on why this matters. So some key points specifically around CN30. So the initiative is designed to strengthen Australia's reputation as a global leader in sustainable production and open up these new revenue opportunities and flow on productivity benefits for producers. The initiative has a dual objective of improving productivity and profitability whilst reducing emissions. Achieving CN30 will support access to high value markets, and that's which are increasingly demanding sustainably produced meat. And we will enhance consumer confidence in the quality and integrity of Australian red meat, whilst minimising regulatory risk. Now, I also want to make sure, this is loud and clear, that achieving CN30 doesn't require a reduction in livestock numbers in Australia. CSIRO analysis, and you can look up that report by Googling that code, B.CCH.7714, shows it's possible to achieve CN30 without reducing herd and flock numbers below the rolling 10-year average up to 2015, which is when that work was done, which is about 25 million cattle, 70 million sheep, 0.5 million goats, and the goat population's increased since then. By 2030, producers will be even more attuned to the influence of things like genetic variability, environmental variability, technological and market factors on red meat production. And they'll be able to access the best information from MLA and other service companies like AMPC and LiveCorp that will enable selection of livestock and with multiple attributes that increase productivity and reduce emissions per kilogram produced. They'll be able to select supplements, pastures, legumes, and tree species with multiple attributes, providing multiple benefits that enable livestock to thrive in more extreme weather and climate conditions. And they'll have access to established markets for low and zero carbon red meat and co-products that we aim to contribute demonstrably to doubling the value of red meat sales. So I've got about 6 minutes left. So I'm going to touch now on what's been achieved to date, and then leave you with some thoughts about how ICMJ students and its network can contribute in this area. So the red meat industry, as I mentioned earlier, contributes 10% of Australia's greenhouse gas emissions, and this figure's halved since 2005. And greenhouse gas emissions from the red meat livestock industry has fallen 57% since 2005. So we've halved our contribution towards national emissions, and our overall absolute net greenhouse gas emissions have reduced 57% since 2005. I just want to also point out in the bottom right-hand quadrant of this infographic that our industry resides over half of Australia's land mass. And when you ask ourselves, well, why is that the case? The vast majority of Australia's land mass, in fact, less than 8% of it, can be utilised for any other economic gain in the agricultural industries and producing red meat. Less than 8% can be used for producing plants under traditional plant-based pathways. Now, that's fundamentally different to a lot of countries globally, and it's why our industry is so prominent as a land steward in our country. But with that stewardship comes great responsibility. So what's MLA been doing? We've been putting together a carbon neutral 2030 pathway that's built around 4 key areas that are listed there 1 to 4, but also represented in this diagram on the right-hand side. The first area is working on technologies and practices to avoid greenhouse gas emissions. The second is working on technologies and practices that promote carbon storage, and storage over decadal timeframes, not seasonal, decadal timeframes. Then thinking about the systems approach to these technologies and practice, so integrating the management systems at a farm level, and at the same time investing in leadership building amongst producers, feedlotters, processors, farming system advisors, and the research community. I know that AMPC have also been doing quite a lot of work in this area. They've done some deep dives into the opportunities in the processing sector to reduce emissions, and they've released a report, and I've just grabbed some snapshots from their recent infographics that shows the work that they've been doing, and they've really got their head around sources of emissions and opportunities in the processing sector. I'm not going to go into any detail today, just to flag that it's there. And they've also mapped out some trajectories out to 2030 under different policy scenarios. So you can see the research and development corporations are really sinking their teeth into this initiative. So what do we need to do, and when do we need to have it achieved? And you can see here a bit of a timeline that just points out some key dates and some key times on which technologies and practices really need to hit the market. So in 2020, the industry has released a carbon accounting tool, which had been previously released, but we've updated it to make it more reflective of red meat production systems. It's available on our website. And we're also about to release later this year, if not early next, a producer training manual, which will be integrated into profitable grazing systems, MLA's profitable grazing systems training module. When we get to 2023, we're really looking to push into the market through our research and commercialisation partners, new and emerging supplements, and some of you might be aware of the Future Feed company, which is now commercialising the red asparaginopsis supplement. There are going to be additional supplements introduced into the market in the next few years. We're also seeing by mid-2025, we would expect to see full adoption of what are new and emerging savanna burning methods that ultimately reduce net greenhouse gas emissions, predominantly in Northern Australia. And then as we get towards the back of the decade, we're going to see we're going to be pushing for rapid adoption of these new plants that provide multiple benefits in grazing systems. So new legume varieties established in quite significant areas. So you can see there we're aiming for 10 million hectares of new establishment of legumes. And if you consider that we reside over 35 million hectares of grazing land, it's about 3%. So these are stretch targets for our industry. I want to also hit you with some practical steps. We was asked to table some of those today, and there's a list of 10, and you can read this in your own time. This slide deck will be made available, but arm yourself with the right knowledge. Consider herd and flock management practices for multiple benefits. Consider energy efficiency and renewable energy technologies within your business. Identify shade and shelter options on farm for multiple benefits. Consider the potential for savanna fire management, particularly in Northern Australia. Monitor and record active dung beetle populations, because we are learning more about the great role they play in improving carbon sequestration, carbon storage and soil health. Plan for the delivery and distribution of new feeds and supplements from in the next few years and beyond. Establish deep-rooted and palatable pastures in legumes. Consider what pastures or mix of pastures, legumes and trees are going to be most suitable for the production environment in which you operate. And then look for collaborative supply chain arrangements. And James is a great example of a brand that's working into consumer markets, wanting to communicate this message, and he's wanting to build a supply chain behind it. So the more we can do to work collaboratively, the greater the impact we're going to be able to create. But however, for the industry to be successful, we need to have industry commitment and buy-in into what we're doing, the right policy settings, industry and business policy settings, as well as government. It's not the role necessarily of government to step into policy. Industry and business can set their own policies, and new investment in research, development and adoption in this area. And if we do that well, then I'll just skip through a couple. We're going to start to see more product leadership. There's some genuinely innovative new product opportunities emerging, things like blending products. So we're going to continue to do what we've always done as a steak on a plate, but there's some new products emerging around blended plant and meat products. And you can see the top right there is a blended meatball. And you're also going to see more businesses getting on with becoming carbon neutral. And James is one of those, is one of the carbon neutral series. You can see there at the bottom right. And I'll leave you with two slides. Also be prepared to think about new ways of thinking. So common production efficiency metrics to date have been around nitrogen use efficiency, water use efficiency, energy use efficiency, feed conversion efficiency. Why not start to think about carbon use efficiency? How efficiently are we making use of the carbon in our system for food production? And it's an interesting way of thinking about your production system. So some key messages for ICMJ students. Be courageous in researching new technologies and practices that provide multiple benefits with a clear path to impact. Industry needs innovative and transformational methods and methods to measure emissions alongside production data. So these methods need to be cost effective, certifiable, robust, remote, given the geographic dispersity of our production systems, reproducible, and they must provide measurement data within time spans that are relevant to business decision making, so in seasonal or yearly timeframes. Invest the time in understanding the business opportunities behind becoming carbon neutral. There is no silver bullet, and that we need to increase the level of understanding to nut out the business opportunities that we know exist. And I got this one from Michael Crowley. He said mentioned that I love merchandise because we've heard good things about ICMJ merch. So we might expect something in the mail. But Thank you, and back to James.
Thanks, Doug. We'll have to get you some socks in the mail somewhere and a couple of cup holders there. So we've got James back online now. Now, while Amy just shares James' presentation again, we've got a question for you here, Doug, just while we're bridging the time. It's from Alistair Jones. Have we had to rethink the amount of carbon that's stored long-term in farms after the 2019-2020 bushfires?
Yeah, so the short answer is no, we haven't gone out and measured the impact of fires. To my knowledge, it won't have impacted soil carbon levels because of the fire being above ground. It may influence the tree carbon levels in some grazing systems. However, we haven't mapped the attribution of our grazing systems land area with the impact of the fires. So that knowledge doesn't exist just yet. I would expect that would show up though in our national greenhouse gas inventory accounts. It's the federal government's inventory accounts in the coming years, because they'll be utilising satellite data to measure the presence or not of trees in those systems.
Very good. Amy, do you want to just share James's presentation there? Ripper, that's where we're up to. And then James, just on mute there, so whenever you're ready.
Yep, how's that? You hear me okay?
Perfect, got you back there. Welcome back.
Cool. Technology, that's all I'm going to say, has an impeccable sense of timing. So I was talking about the golden circle, and I think I just got to the middle of the golden circle, which was the why. And that it's a relatively recent way of business thinking, this purpose-driven sense of alignment that companies are trying to strive for within their organizations. And it brings out some, like I was saying, some really interesting and challenging questions for not just companies, but also the people who run them. So I used this framework that Simon Sinek has come up with, which is the golden circle, to try and layer our organization beyond just having a product or a point of difference, but also to having a purpose. So if we can go to the next slide, please, Amy. Okay, and you can click through so that they all pop up. Doug, I'm sure you probably covered off on a lot of this, but this was when we were going through this process, we were looking at a lot of research that was coming out showing that, you know, consumers are really interested in sustainability. There was a lot of buzz around sustainability. This is a couple of years ago, and there still is. And that, you know, consumers increasingly were looking towards attributes that reflect sustainability when they were making their purchasing decisions. And you can see a couple of them there. The one there that says 66% relates to all consumers say they'd pay more for sustainable produce. I think that goes up to about 75% when you just account for the millennial demographic. And 4 in 5 Australians, I can't even read that, they wanted to be ethical and sustainable. So there was this sort of clear drive towards, you know, as a population of people become more affluent, they tend to climb up this hierarchy that we refer to. They climb up this hierarchy that we refer to as Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and they tend to start to make more ideological purchasing decisions. And all decisions throughout their life tend to follow. They become less based around necessarily just basic needs, and they start to become more ideology driven. So we sort of saw this and we thought that we needed our purpose to also be strategic as well as aspirational. So if you go to the next slide, Amy, please. And you can click through so that, it all pops up. So we had a good look at what our DNA as a company is. We've been well known for high quality, for animal welfare, for provenance and storytelling. We thought about why we needed a why, and looking at, what's the deeper meaning behind our company? Why are people coming to work beyond just money? Why does our company exist beyond just money? And then trying to weave that story and make sure that it's strategic as well. If we're going to have a purpose, it can't necessarily be a backward-looking purpose. We need it to be forward-looking so that we can take advantage of growth markets. So we came up with a vision which was to cultivate a better food world. We thought that there was a grain of truth in that statement that had run through our company's history. We thought it was quite meaningful and interesting, an interesting project to work on for 10 or 20 years. And we thought it was also strategic, that consumers are interested and will tend to align themselves with companies that share their beliefs. And the data was telling us that their beliefs are really around, looking beyond just a product, but how that product is produced and the impact that it has. So we'll go to the next slide, please, Amy. So that was our new company logo, Flinders & Co. Cultivate Better. Much better than the first try, I thought. If you go to the next one. So the realization was I've got no fucking idea how to cultivate a better food world. Sorry, I didn't actually write that in there, but that's what it was meant to say. Consumers in the modern day have great bullshit detectors. So if you try to pull the wool over their eyes, either they'll call you out because it's quite obvious what you're doing, or someone on social media will just dig a little bit below the surface and they'll call you out. So it's not enough, even though a lot of companies still do, you really leave yourself open to danger if you only talk the talk. You need to walk the walk, and you need to be honest about how you're going to walk that walk. So one of the things that we do is we are very honest in admitting to ourselves, our staff, our customers, that the notion of cultivating a better food world is very subjective, means something different to each person that hears it, and that we're not experts. I'm still figuring it out as we go. I feel like I've maybe done 2% of the work that we ultimately need to do to become experts in this space. So it was more of an aspirational vision that would hopefully encourage us to walk the path to achieve it. And it is going to be a long path to achieve cultivating a better food world. If we go to the next slide and make all the pretty pictures pop up, we did put together a framework around how we would achieve this. So I'll really quickly go through this, but we laid the vision. You've really got to bring the sort of airy-fairy, fluffy vision piece down into concrete actions. And, same with MLA, with CN30, it's a nice sort of bold statement to make, but people, want to know that there's meat on the bones, so to speak. And we did that with our 4 pillars, our focus areas, and each of those focus areas feeds into a number of different actual projects that we embark on. So it's a way of chunking up and chunking down from cultivating a better food world as our overarching belief to, okay, what are the actual individual things that we're going to do to try and achieve that? And it might be something as simple as, switching out to a more environmentally friendly copy paper. It can be tiny, or it can be something quite large, like a carbon neutral project. We'll go to the next slide. So the carbon neutral, and I've got here the world's first carbon neutral meat supplier. I couldn't find anyone else in the world that had done it. So like I said at the start, I keep claiming that we're the first, and until someone sues me, I keep saying it. But the reason that this project was attractive to us was we wanted to have a big first project when we launched our brand. We wanted to show people that we were serious in walking the walk. It aligned well with our 4 pillars and our focus areas. And I could clearly see, with the CN30 program from MLA, that this was the direction the industry was going, and that, there wasn't anyone else that had done it at that point. So the brief process in terms of how we achieve carbon neutrality as a meat company, and you've got to remember the part of the supply chain that we hold now is we're not a farmer, we're not a processor, we're not a retailer, we are a distributor. So we hold a very sort of segmented part of the supply chain between the end customer, which is, well, not even the end customer. We sell to chefs and retailers. So we're another step away from the end customer, but we sit in between the chef or the retailer and the processor, typically the abattoir. So we engaged carbon consultants, found some experts, and originally we were only going to become carbon neutral for our operations here in Melbourne. So our warehouse, our delivery vans, you know, any travel, all those sorts of things, electricity. But the consultants actually suggested to us that maybe we should consider making our product carbon neutral as well. And that is a different thing, because instead of just offsetting your activities as a business, you're offsetting all of the downstream carbon emissions that are involved with every product that you sell to every customer everywhere. So my response to that was, well, that sounds expensive. But they went through a process. They decided that they were going to investigate it and they would cover the costs. And they basically analysed all of our sales as a company: grass-fed beef, grain-fed beef, lamb, kangaroo, wallaby, quail, whatever it was we sold, and to which customers we sold it. And they were able to use existing what are called life cycle assessments. So life cycle assessments are academic studies that measure the carbon footprint of something. And there's a lot of them out there for different livestock and meat-producing animals. So we were able to figure out what the carbon footprint was, not only of our company, but also of all the products that we sold in a year. And given where we sit in the supply chain, we only have limited ability to influence how products are farmed. We're quite a number of steps away from the farm, where real changes in measurement and action can lead to more carbon sequestration. So we're a little bit removed from the farms. The most immediate thing that we could do, therefore, to achieve our carbon neutrality was to invest in offsets. And offsets are basically, you're effectively making a carbon abatement project viable somewhere else by buying these offsets. And these carbon abatement projects would not necessarily be otherwise viable if there were not customers like us purchasing the offsets that they generate. So if we go 2 slides forward, Amy. Go to the next one and then the one after it. Yeah, we don't have to talk about hairy audacious. Yeah, okay. So the easiest way to think about it is the emissions that are released in our supply chain for the products that we sell. We make sure that we equalize those emissions by either drawing back carbon into the soil or some other medium, or we negate the production of other emissions in the first place. So that's how we achieve carbon neutrality. We've launched both a carbon neutral retail range that Doug had an image of, but we also, most of our business prior to COVID was into restaurants, high-end restaurants. And we've used the carbon neutral claim as a bit of a party piece for us as a company to show that the product that we sell is different, its attributes are different, and we're serious about doing what we say. In terms of the outcome, you can probably stop sharing that now, Amy. Just focus on me. That's the end of the PowerPoint. In terms of outcome, it's been mixed. One of the things that I've learned is that consumers who report certain things on surveys are really crap at analysing what they might do in the future, or what they might buy in the future, or what purchasing decision they might take hypothetically, because they tend to answer these surveys based on what they think their best self would do. Oh yes, of course, I would buy the sustainable product, or I would buy the free-range eggs, or the more humane thing. But when they actually get in store and when they have a split second to make a decision, and the budget's tight, and COVID and mortgage and blah, blah, blah. More of them don't buy the high welfare, environmentally friendly product than say they do. So the response we've had wasn't as overwhelmingly strong as the sort of data led me to think it would be. Part of that might be we haven't marketed it as well as we could have. But I think part of it is that consumers are a bit fickle. What they say on a survey and what they do in a store is different. And I also think it's early in the piece. There is a factor of early adopters that will seek out these sorts of products, but it's not as, I wouldn't say that it's mainstream, at least not compared to what the data suggests. And we've interestingly had more interest from other overseas markets than we have from the domestic market. So affluent markets like Singapore, Hong Kong, EU, US, these guys are really interested in carbon neutrality, probably more than the domestic market. So I still think that it's a sound strategy, and I really admire the industry for going down the carbon neutrality path, and we want to play a part in it. But, it's not all rosy. There are still challenges around not only the production of it, but also making sure that we have enough consumers that are prepared to pay a premium for it. And I think I've just almost gone over time, Hamish.
No, that's perfect. Thanks very much. It's a great example, I guess, of really understanding from Doug's discussion around the target behind CN30 and becoming carbon neutral. It's good to hear how business has gone about, I guess, approaching that and marketing that, but also about the feedback from, I guess you said, from suppliers and customers on whether they will really pay the price for the cost of changing those systems. It's always interesting to see the differences between intended and actual decision making at the point of purchase and what that means to the business. So we'll open up the floor now to some questions for either Doug or James there. So I guess one question I had for you, Doug, just while they're jumping in is as a producer or a processor or someone, what's the first step in moving towards that CN30 target? It's obviously a pretty broad range of strategies to try and get there, but what's step number one for a lot of people out there, especially producers?
It's the old adage of you can't manage what you can't measure, right? So it doesn't matter whether you're producing cattle or whether you're producing carbon credits. You got to get your head around your production system. So you got to measure certain attributes. What's interesting is we've been piloting a carbon accounting tool in the last 6 months with producers, and it's by no means perfect. It's probably got another 3 or 4 iterations in it to go. But when you plot the inputs into those tools for decision making, they're synergistic with the production system itself. How many cattle, what categories, what are their growth rates, what are they eating? When you get those insights, you actually get overall business insights. So that's the first step. Can't manage what you can't measure. And if you're just going to sit back and hope it sorts itself out, well, don't be surprised if nothing changes.
Yeah, absolutely. And the timeline, I guess we have to act now. 10 years isn't a very long time to make that progress. We've made a fair bit over the past 10 years, I guess, in terms of halving our emissions as an industry, but there's a long way to go before we get to that neutrality, I guess.
And there's obviously some key areas that we should focus in, and then key geographies that we can focus in as well. I mean, it's not every producer has to do this, right? It'd be great if everyone did, because we might even get to a position where we're even the most climate resilient country on the planet, red meat producing country on the planet, and we're really jumping ahead in consumer markets. But at the same time, I don't want to say I'm not saying not everyone needs to do it, such that everyone's listening and go, okay, cool, I'll just sit back and wait for someone else to step in. But what I'm saying is we don't need everyone to take action. But if you can encourage and motivate, mass action in this area, I think based on the insights that we have to date, we can only see upside.
Very good. Now there's a question in the chat there from Duncan Rowland, Doug, which I think you'd made a couple of comments on, but just to open it up to the wider group is, how do you define the boundaries of the production chain? Do you include areas such as transport or livestock production, feed additives as part of that encompassing supply chain in red meat?
Yeah. So the boundary, and again, it's in that all bunch of really detailed technical questions that can be answered by just having a flick through that CSIRO report, B.CCH 7714. But the system boundary is on-farm, feedlots, and processing, and also the animals up until the point they leave the country if they're in the live export system. It does include transport, some transport processes, predominantly in between those nodes in the supply chain, and also transport of inputs into the system. And also does include, to some extent, the emissions that are incurred in production of feed for feedlots. There's quite a detailed explanation of the system boundary. There's no grey areas for the vast majority of the major emission sources. There's no grey areas. There are some grey areas for the minor sources that we just, for weight of effort versus reward, we haven't kind of gone into the minutiae.
Very good. And James, we've got another question for you there from Darcy Ryder. Has there been any pushback from consumers about Flinders & Co purchasing the offsets rather than the farmer offsetting at their end? If not, what other issues besides price have come up?
No, there hasn't been any pushback. We did think about that in the early days. It would have been nice to have more of a story around, an integrated holistic system for carbon credits, us purchasing carbon credits from our farmers that are in our direct supply chain potentially. But I don't think the consumer is that sophisticated without offending any consumers. I think that from their perspective, the carbon neutral badge is enough at this stage. I don't think they're really looking much deeper than that. I don't necessarily think most of them are that interested beyond that. So as long as they see that claim, I think that ticks their box. What other pushback have we had? Probably we've had less success in food service than I would have thought domestically. I just don't, chefs have a lot of pressures on them from their companies, from their bosses, from their managers, and they have a real price squeeze, especially now, I think, in the sort of COVID era. So while some of them might like the idea, it's probably further down the purchasing priority decision-making list than I would have envisaged at the start of it. So it's a nice little 1%er. If we're at a similar price to a competitor, a similar quality, a similar offering, it might be the 1% that gets us home. But rarely is it the number one purchasing factor for any customer.
Yeah. And we're running a little bit tight on time, so I'll just throw out one more question. And Amy, while I throw this one out, it might be good to pop up the feedback quiz there. But and this is probably a question for both James and Doug, so feel free to jump in. But it's from Rhett Simpson. Is there an existing framework within the meat production supply chain to trade or pass on carbon credits? As an industry, can we be self-sufficient?
So the short answer to that is yes. There are established certification and verification pathways. And so happy for whoever asked that question, sorry, the name just didn't pop up for me, to reach out and we can provide what information we have. There are a number of businesses that actually provide those services. So James used a business, Carbon Reduction Institute with no CO2, I think is the logo he uses on his brand. Federal government has a process you can pass through to the Climate Active program. There are new and emerging service providers in international markets too, because the logo also needs to, all the certification process and the output needs to be relevant to the market in which you're servicing as well. So if the market doesn't understand a logo and you're in, high value in China or Europe, you're going to need to understand what brand attributes and what logos actually speak to those markets. So there's a bit in that, understanding which way to go. And so there are a multitude of options. I don't say that meaning to confuse and complicate others, people. However, it's quite interesting. Some people assume that there's nothing there. There's actually quite a lot. There's quite a lot of services that you can tap into. It's just a matter of deciding which one, and we're certainly happy to help people do that.
Perfect. Thanks very much. All right, we might wrap it up there. So a big thanks to James and Doug for sharing your time and the information today. It's been great to understand, I guess, both sides of that carbon neutrality target there for CN30 from both a consumer and a producer all the way through that supply chain. So thanks very much for that. Now, just as a final bit of information, we've got another webinar planned for the 21st of November, which is with Dave Johnson and Beck Komsky. Basically the topic on that is humps, eggs, and pregs. How can we breed for them all? Essentially focusing on northern beef production. So put it in your diaries and keep an eye on the ICMJ social media. We'll have all the details come through there. So a big thanks again to James and Doug, and thanks to all our listeners today. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you in about a month's time.